Okay, now we're official. And I don't like to make those who are here on time wait. So in another minute, we'll start, if that's okay, Benjamin.
Yeah,
And the
sure.
rest of you, feel free to continue to tell us where you're signing in from. If there's something you're hoping to hear, some, um, if there's a personality that you are saying that you really need to hear about, we'd love to hear about it. It may not be this time, might be for next time, but it would be great to hear what you're hoping to hear today. So if you want to share that as well, if there's something there. So I will begin. So first, welcome and thank you for joining us on behalf of Jewish Tapestry. Please note our new name. I'm very excited about that. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback for that. The tapestry, the strings within the tapestry. So um, thank you for those who have given us feedback. It's really helpful when we hear back from you, when we hear stories. Two things I want to mention before we start today. The first one is thank you to those who have been supporting financially our programming. We hope that you will continue and that those who aren't will add to it as well. Without your support, we can't continue and we can't open up more programs because there are many more things we want to be talking about. So that's one. The other one is if you have not heard our podcast yet, Ayuni Voices of Our Jewish Grandmothers that we do in coordination with Sarah Sassoon. Um, Please be sure to hear it because our second season is now being recorded. So we're excited. In another probably 2 months, we'll be launching that. So we hope that you will be listening to it. And if there's somebody that you feel we must be interviewing, now's the time. So please let us know if there is a woman who you need to talk about or who we need to talk to. Please do, because part of what we need sharing are our stories. So those are my two pitches. I won't take too much longer. I will ask Benjamin, rather than me introducing him, to introduce himself. So, Dr. Benjamin Berman Gladstone has been working on and off with us for a while, and we are so pleased to have him back because every time he speaks, he brings in something new and something interesting. And I think today is definitely going to be one of those. I've heard him talk about some of these personalities before and some of those, and I'm excited to really, I always learn when I hear from him. So, again, rather than me saying who he is, I'm going to let him introduce himself. And just a little technical, I ask you to keep your microphones off. You can have your cameras on or off for the talk, but at the end, we do ask you to turn your cameras on so we can see who we're talking to. But please do make sure to keep your microphones off. And any comments or questions, I will be monitoring the chat. So if there's anything urgent, I will break in. Otherwise, we'll let Benjamin give, or Dr. Berman Gladstone give his um, presentation. And I hand the mic over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm Benjamin Berman Gladstone. I've had the real pleasure of working with Drora and with Jewish Tapestry and its earlier iterations and now and also excited with the new name. I'm currently the postdoctoral fellow in Jewish thought at the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia University. This talk is kind of an evolution of that, the research I've done there and some of the teaching that I've done there as well. And I'm next year going to be a fellow at the Katz Center at the University of Pennsylvania. So that's the next sort of step. So thank you very much, everyone, for having me here and for coming to learn about this topic. We're going to open in Cairo in 1945. Two men go to the gallows. One is from Lebanon, the other from a family with deep roots in the territory of Mandate Palestine. The crime of which they are guilty is gunning down a top British colonial official in the street. At their trial, one of them had delivered a bold speech in which he inveighed against colonial imperial injustices, against the colonists treating Palestine as they did many parts of the world. What mattered to him, he said, was not the Balfour Declaration or any international guarantees, but the right to the land derived from indigeneity. If not for the topic of today's talk, you might be surprised to learn that these two men went to the gallows singing Hatikva, the Zionist anthem that a few short years later would be the national anthem of the State of Israel. The men were Eliyahu Hakim and Eliyahu Beit Suri, two agents of the right-wing Lehi militia. The man they assassinated was the Baron Moyne, who had served as colonial secretary in the early 1940s and was then the top British colonial official governing the Middle East from Cairo, and who had played significant roles in opposing Jewish Holocaust refugees' attempts to escape to Palestine. The important and sometimes unique roles that Middle Eastern and North African Jews played in Israel's independence struggle, first in driving out the British colonists and then in establishing and defending Israel's new borders against Arab armies, is just one piece of a much larger story that I want to tell today. The bigger story is really that of Zionism and the State of Israel, but from a perspective grounded in the actual region in which Israel is situated, the Middle East on the cusp of North Africa. It is an oft overlooked fact that most Israeli Jews have some Mizrahi or Sephardi background, and that has been true for the substantial majority of Israel's history since the 1960s. When we talk about Israel as basically a European country, or narrate its story beginning in Europe, I would argue that we fundamentally misunderstand the country. So, in belated celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, we're going to retell the story of Zionism in Israel from the perspective of its own region. I start my courses on Zionism, which I've been teaching at Columbia, with the Damascus Affair in 1840. The Damascus Affair was a blood libel incident facilitated primarily by the French consul in Damascus, which led to the arrest and torture of approximately 70 Jews. Some were killed, some were converted to Islam. The French consul demanded sexual favors of Jewish women. A French-backed propaganda campaign spread the idea of the blood libel across and beyond Damascus. Popular mobs ransacked Jewish homes and communities. This is a rough map of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, and these are some of the places that had blood libels between the Damascus Affair and the end of the 19th century. So you see Alexandria, Port Said, Cairo, Damanhur, Rhodes, Izmir, Istanbul, Salonika, Beirut, Damascus again, Monastir, we can go on. So sometimes these were small scale events and sometimes larger. Sometimes there were successive waves of blood libels, anti-Jewish media campaigns, beatings in the streets in the same city. And in each case, the safety and stability of the local Jewish community was threatened. The Damascus Affair, as many of us might know, had ripple effects beyond the Ottoman Empire. Local Jews asked their co-religionists both elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire and in Europe to help them in their moment of peril. And Jews in not only Anatolia, but also London, Paris, and New York heeded the call. The organized Jewish community of the United Kingdom, spearheaded by a wealthy Sephardi man by the name of Moses Montefiore, joined forces with Jews of France, represented by Cremu, to ask for the British and French government's interventions. For France, this would mean reprimanding their own employees, something they were loath to do, and to try to intercede themselves with the relevant authorities. Eventually, with a very public campaign, these European Jewish leaders were able to make the issue embarrassing for France. A handful of surviving Jewish notables were released from prison. This is a letter from their wives to Lady Montefiore. A meeting of Jews in New York also launched the first significant effort by American Jews to intervene with the US government in support of Jews abroad. It was basically not successful, but it did set a very significant precedent, which would become relevant in later years during waves of anti-Jewish violence in Russia and elsewhere. So three very significant things came out of the Damascus Affair. First, it was a frightening example of the potential instability of Jewish life in the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East, and North Africa, the parts of the world, again, from which most Israeli Jews come, under conditions of modernization and European colonialism. A European consul had backed this basically European Christian idea of a blood libel, and it had quickly taken root in the surrounding society, leading to waves of mob violence against Jews for decades. This is from 1986. It's a 1986 edition of the Protocols of the Damascus Affair trials, published in Arabic by the Syrian Minister of Defense under Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father. Second, It marked a new beginning for international Jewish philanthropic efforts, bringing together Jews from Europe, the United States, and the Middle East in solidarity with one another. Often, this has been a very imperfect solidarity, but nonetheless a powerful unity of purpose across oceans and seas. And third, it brings us to the first major thought leader that I want to discuss today, the Ottoman Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai. Alkalai began writing in the 1820s, but his work intensified in direct response to the Damascus Affair. He wrote within a messianic framework, moving between the Middle East and Southern Europe and building arguments primarily from religious proofs embedded in the Sephardi religious tradition. Ultimately, he advocated for many of the things that would later be associated with modern political Zionism: the establishment of a Jewish society to facilitate first small scale and then larger scale migration and land acquisition in the land of Israel, the importance of working the land itself as a spiritual act, Hebrew language, and the restoration of feelings of unity among the Jewish people. To Alkali, the observance of religious commandments, and particularly those surrounding agriculture, was also a key component of the vision. In Alkali's view, the Jews of the Ottoman Empire were ready to embark upon this project, but were dependent on the awakening of Northern European Jewry to their plight. A feeling of collective mutual responsibility among Jews was necessary in significant part in order to recruit Ashkenazi Jewry into this project, alerting them to their responsibility to help their co-religionists in the Ottoman Empire. Theodor Herzl's grandfather, with whom Herzl was close, was a disciple of Alkalai's. It seems unlikely that Herzl spontaneously came up with many of the same ideas that his grandfather had studied under Alkalai. So, even by the narrowest definition of Zionism as a political movement built in substantial part by Herzl himself, we ought properly to identify Zionism's roots in the Ottoman Empire. The context of the Damascus Affair is key because it means that starting our history of Zionism with Alkalai, as opposed to with Herzl, results in a meaningfully different understanding of Zionism as a body of thought. Herzl was responding to crises of European Jewry, mythically the Dreyfus Affair. But Alkalai was responding to the crises of Middle Eastern Jewry, and more specifically to colonial anti-Semitism and persecutions in the Ottoman Empire. Referring to him then opens up a history of Zionism rooted in Sephardi religious and political thought, and one that confronts Middle Eastern Jewish crises arising from European colonialism and anti-Jewish populism, before and only then alongside its reapplication to the Ashkenazi European arena. Another important corrective that I want to bring to you today, and one that has emerged in recent scholarship, is the rejection, or at least the complication nuancing, of the traditional binary of Old Yishuv and New Yishuv. As the sort of traditional historiographic view has it, Jewish life in the land of Israel between more or less the destruction of the Second Temple and the 1880s was basically religious, conservative, and apolitical. Only with the forerunner movements to political Zionism did new Olim come and begin the real process of upbuilding the land of Israel toward becoming the state of Israel. Newer historiography is now catching up with the writings of Middle Eastern Zionist thinkers as long ago as the early 20th century, who pointed out how essential the Sephardi institutions of the Old Yishuv were to facilitating Zionism in its more political forms later on. Jews did not exist passively in the land of Israel for all those centuries, but built homes and academies, communities, and councils. They maintained ties with Ottoman officials and Arab landowners that facilitated the immigration of the first European Zionists to Palestine and the first land sales to Zionist institutions. And Tebby on the screen here is one of these sort of complicating, nuanced middle ground figures who, though not really associated with Zionism himself, played a really crucial role in facilitating some of these early transactions. In the meantime, just as Zionism gathered steam in Europe, so too did it emerge around the Middle East and North Africa. We tend to talk about European Zionism as though it was a unique story, but in fact, there are meaningful parallels with other parts of the world. Take Morocco, for example, which would become one of the major sending countries of Olim to Israel. From 1873 to 1894, there was a process of state consolidation in Morocco with a stabilizing central monarchy. But from that point on, from 1894 until 1912, less successful rulers tried and mostly failed to modernize, and they basically were unable to overcome internal issues paired with colonial incursions, French and Spanish. And over the course of this period, Morocco becomes a French protectorate mostly. Also, during that period of chaos, there are bouts of anti-Jewish violence, raids on melachs, the Jewish quarters, during tribal uprisings against the centralizing states. Clashing armed contingents would loot, rape, and kidnap Jews for ransom or sale into slavery. Soldiers and indigenous communities falling to colonial troops also vented their anger against the colonists by robbing and raping local Jews. The first Zionist groups emerged in Morocco in this period. One important influence on this process was the Haskalah, often called the Jewish Enlightenment, which spanned North Africa as well as Europe. Alliance figures in the Alliance Israélite Universelle navigated between French, Arab, and different kinds of Jewish cultural forces, and often played important roles in Zionist movement building, despite the Alliance's non-Zionist and often even anti-Zionist stance. When fascism arrived in North Africa, Nazi race laws applied by the Vichy regime, it spurred a surge in Zionist activism, as it became clear that assimilation into the colonial culture was not a long-term path to Jewish security. This story, periods of instability in the late 19th and early 20th century, Jews caught between empires and nationalism, anti-Jewish rioting rendering an old system of subjugation but relative stability now unstable and frightening, the influence of the Haskalah, the pressure to navigate several different cultural milieus, and finally the rise of fascism, fundamentally changing the relationships between most Jews and their surrounding societies and the ruling powers, will be familiar to us from other regions as well. This is the story of Zionism in Morocco, but it's also the story of Zionism in Eastern and Western Europe, and there are substantial parallels in Iran, Iraq, and other parts of the world as well. So the point I'm making here is that whereas we typically talk about this European story that then gets projected elsewhere, we can actually look in the same period at a lot of the same processes happening and leading to the establishment of Zionist movements all over the broader region and world. We've talked a little bit about the origins of Zionist ideas in Ottoman contexts and Zionist institutions in the Old Yishuv, and we've thought about we thought a little bit about Zionism as a political movement emerging in various parts of the world, not just Europe, with Morocco as our main example. And now I want to bring another really important subject, which is immigration or aliyah. Many of us may know that Israel doubled and then tripled in population size quite quickly. This is in part because of a series of unprecedented operations. Operations like On Eagle's Wings, which brought Jews en masse from Yemen and Aden to Israel, and Ezra and Nehemiah, which brought Jews at scale from Iraq. There were equivalents as well from Ethiopia, from Morocco, from Libya, etc. My own research is on Yemen and Aden, so I'll start there. One of the really early mass migrations, precedent-setting in a lot of ways, facilitated by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and the Jewish Agency, was Operation On Eagle's Wings. This is about 50,000 Jews, mostly in 1949, coming from Yemen and Aden to, which was at the time a separate British colony, to Israel via Aden. My book project that I'm working on now is about the role of the Jewish Emergency Committee, which was the leadership of Jews in Aden, which lobbied and pressed, actually blackmailed the British colonial authorities in Aden to permit an immigration they didn't want to permit of Jews from Yemen to Aden en route to Israel. And they also separately pressed the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to include Adeni Jews who otherwise were going to be excluded from this migration in the process. At the same time, within Israel, figures like Yisrael Yishayahu Sharabi, a longtime labor Zionist activist and politician who would later go on to be Speaker of the Knesset and who himself came from Yemen, pressed David Ben-Gurion and other labor Zionist leaders, the leaders of the state, to facilitate this migration. Yeshayahu Sharabi also separately pressed the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee from Israel to facilitate this migration. And when there was controversy and racist backlash in Israel in the fall of 1949, he led a delegation of Yemeni Israeli Jews to Aden and convinced the Israeli government to keep going anyway, and take what might have been a precedent-setting failure of a migration, and make it instead a precedent-setting success. So the point of this piece of the story is to communicate to you that the story we often tell of of push and pull factors of Middle Eastern North African Jews as refugees, which is often true, but in various ways as sort of objects of state policy, either of Israeli policy or of the policies of Arab countries, has to be complicated by our understanding that actually these figures themselves played essential roles both from their local contexts, in this case Aden, and from the Israeli side in bridging these societies and making these operations possible. There's a parallel story here among for Ethiopian Jewry. It's another story of political organization and also actually religious pressure from the community itself. Many of us will know that one of the really important factors in making the mass migration from Ethiopia possible was Rav Ovadia Yosef's ruling that Ethiopian Jews are and have always been a part of the Jewish community. And this ruling is, of course, on very solid religious and historical grounds, but he took up the question in the first place because of pressure from Ethiopian Jewish activists with the help of Ghazi Ovadia, a Yemeni Jewish figure with deep ties, including through marriage, in Ethiopia. So even this sort of religious transformation followed then by pressure on Prime Minister Menachem Begin and the Knesset, Israel's parliament, to formalize Israel's recognition of Ethiopian Jews on the heels of that ruling all was brought were all brought about in significant part by activist pressure from Ethiopian Jews. Um, this all paved the way to Operation Moses 1984 and Solomon in 1991. So this is just an example to show that this is not a unique story to the Yemeni and Adani case, but actually a larger story where we should revise fundamentally our view of immigration in Israeli history to understand it as something that depended on the work and political activism, etc., of the communities themselves. It's also not just a contribution story to from the perspective of Israeli history. It's fundamentally the shape of the state of Israel. If Israel is a set of institutions or a state, as we or an idea or a population, all of these, as we've discussed to this point, have to be understood as at least half Middle Eastern and North African. So if we're thinking about Israel in Eurocentric terms, again, we're missing something really fundamental. We're missing the real story of the country. Okay, now we'll come to the really hot topic, a discussion of the implications of all this for the accusation that Israel is basically a colonial venture, recentering the history of most Israeli Jews whose relationship with with Europe and colonialism was and is, to say the very least, much more complicated than the oft-repeated and I think easily falsified metaphor of Zionism as colonialism allows, enables us to move beyond that simple politically motivated equation. If we conceptualize the history of Zionist thought as beginning with Alkalai's response to colonial anti-Semitism, as shaped by the lived experiences and textual production of Jews displaced from French and post-French North Africa, and from British occupied parts of the region that saw repeated anti-Jewish violence, links to British rule. I'm thinking here of Aden, where my own research focuses, and Tripoli is another example where British colonists oversaw serious violence against Jewish community, as actualized by the violent revolt of Jewish militias against British rule. We saw that a little bit at the beginning of our talk, and is shaped and reshaped by figures like Eliyahu Eliashar, who I put up on the screen earlier, Jacqueline Kanoff, who we're about to mention, and Albert Memmi and others, whose visions are in many ways true to Israel today, from its cultural pluralism to its resistance to orders by neo-colonial powers. The relationship between Zionism and colonialism starts to look very different. Acknowledging this opens the door to a great many really interesting paths of study. And I am coming at this as a historian, as a scholar of this subject, and so my first sort of question is, what does this allow us to understand better or differently about Israel and also the conflict? So we can now look seriously, for example, at the ways in which anti-colonial thought and movements have inspired and informed Zionism. And we can spend more time on post-colonial thinkers like the Tunisian Zionist Albert Memmi, who saw Zionism as the Jews' way of overcoming their colonized and often doubly colonized state. Or the works of Tamrat Emanuel, the Beta Israel Zionist who wrote against Italian fascism and colonial atrocities in Ethiopia, while he both tried to bring Ethiopian Jewry into more contact with the wider Jewish world and wrestled with the racism he repeatedly encountered in those interactions. Or even outside of what we might call the Middle Eastern, North African, or Mizrahi and Sephardi world, Menachem Begin's allusions to South and Central American anti-colonial struggles as part of a common resistance to British colonial hegemony, alongside, in his view, revisionist Zionism. We can also start to see the ways in which the Zionist movement and writings inspired other movements against colonial powers. Leonardo Cohen wrote a very interesting article a few years ago about the ways in which the Eritrean People's Liberation Front used Ber Borochov's writings, Marxist Zionism. We can pay greater attention to writings about North African anti-colonial struggles by Jacqueline Kanoff. She was the great promoter of Levantinization, is the term that she used, as a sort of a critique of she promoted it as a good thing, as a critique of sort of the dog whistle that against immigration as something that would make Israel too Levantine. She grew up in Egypt with parents of respectively Tunisian and Iraqi Jewish background and pressed for Israeli culture, society, and politics to be more fully a part of the Middle East. She maintained a vision of a kind of cosmopolitan Levantine unity that would include Israel. She writes that her parents in Cairo hosted Tunisian and Algerian anti-colonial revolutionaries who were frustrated to depend upon Nasser when they saw Israel as a better model of struggle against colonialism. Her parents related the following to her about a conversation they had with the Algerian National Liberation Front, FLN leader Ahmed Ben Bella. I remember his lending me Menachem Begin's book, The Revolt. He expressed deep admiration for Israel and said the Jews were perfectly right in their desire for their own state, and that achieving independence was a wonder. Begin, he said, was his Bible. He had learned everything from the man. He also told us a great deal about kibbutzim and the Histadrut and the workers' government and social institutions there. He said Israel was a civilization of the avant-garde, and when Algeria achieved its independence, it would be possible for his country to follow Israel's example in many things in order to solve its own economic and social problems, except that at the moment, Algeria had to ally itself with Nasser, Egypt, and the Arab League. It had no choice. Recent research has begun to shed light also on the implications of the study of Middle Eastern and North African Jewry for our understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab conflicts, which is really what we're talking about when we wrestle with the Israel's colonialism narrative. In particular, scholars have been interested in the subject of Asian and African Jews as critics of both Zionist and Arab nationalist policies, and as cultural and political diplomatic mediators, potential and actual, between Jewish and Arab communities and institutions, and as the protagonists of potential and actual integration of Israel into the region. This has been a really very productive line of thinking. Scholars like Avi Shilon, Abigail Jacobson, and Moshe Naor, and the compilers and biographers of specific thinkers like Kanoff have been at the forefront of this research. Once we open up the possibility seeing of seeing Zionism in its anti and post-colonial contexts, I think we can understand the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab conflicts in a whole new light, as yet another set of post-colonial conflicts shaped by, at best, colonial incompetence in managing nationalist movements and ethnic difference, and at worst, deliberate or semi-deliberate divide and rule policies by colonial powers. We would do well to remember that the famous anti-Semitic populist Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who did so much to put Palestinian nationalism and Zionism at odds in the first place, from a long period in which there were lots of serious efforts at rapprochement and finding other sorts of possibilities. He was appointed to his position as Grand Mufti of Jerusalem by the British, despite his electoral defeat in the race for that position by supporters of the opposing Nashashibi family. The British also established the institution of the Supreme Muslim Council, which enhanced his power. We might also note the attempts by the Histadrut to resolve the Jewish-Arab economic and national competition that scholars like Gershon Shafir famously argued was at the heart of the conflict in its early days, through the establishment of a minimum wage in Palestine, an initiative rejected by the British. We might take seriously the historical memory and documentation of Jews from across the Middle East and North Africa. Sorry. That British colonial forces were often implicated in interethnic violence, and we might think about the exercise of British power over Iraq during the 1940s when Jewish life there became more and more difficult. My own research has turned up cases of English officers literally ordering Arab colonial militiamen to fire upon Jews. That's from the Adani context. We might also see the expansion of the conflict from a semi-local one involving primarily Jews and Arabs in Palestine, now Israel and Palestine, to a really international one, with reference to Meir Zamir's finding, which has received shockingly little attention, that British intelligence agents persuaded Arab leaders to fear Zionism as an extension of communism and goaded them into joining the 1948 war. Something that should not really surprise us, given the extent to which Britain was still pulling the strings in Arab capitals at the time, building up Arab armies and at times even leading them into battle, as in the case of John Glubb, who literally led the Arab Legion during the 1948 war. We may treat the Zionist revolt against the British not as an aberrant demonstration of Jewish ingratitude, but as one example among many of a very familiar pattern of armed anti-colonial resistance by communities across Africa and Asia no longer willing to endure colonial rule. Here then are the wider and perhaps more politically charged implications of treating Israel more seriously as a Middle Eastern society. Here also is the motivation for continuing to erase Middle Eastern and North African Jews. Only if Middle Eastern and North African Jews can be dismissed as objects of and not fundamentally a part of, even the core of the history of Israel and Zionism, can these nuances of Israel's history be suppressed. And for those who want to tell the story of Israel as a simple one of a European colony that is yet to go the natural way of all colonies, they'd be advised to ignore everything we've said here today. For those who want to understand Israel, though, including the conflict, they'll need to understand something about the history of most Israelis. Israel is fundamentally part of the region. All Israelis are Middle Eastern today, and most Israelis are, of course, part of the long history of the Jewish people, which is intimately and inextricably bound up with the Jewish homeland. It's not just that the ancient Israelite and Jewish kingdoms were in the same land. The British Museum, for all of their colonial rule here, has on display a message to a pharaoh from a vassal lord in the same territory complaining against Hebrews, or that you can go now and visit ancient synagogues there, but also that the Jewish religious and ethical tradition bears the indelible imprint of this land, right? The agricultural laws that shaped our society entirely and that are such an important part of Alkalai's understanding of the unique relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel apply only in that land, or the holidays are synced up with the agricultural cycle of that land. But it's not just about this sort of awkward question that raises of whether or not indigeneity has an expiration date. It's also about the fact that most Israeli Jews today are descended from families that never left the region or that have been there for centuries since the Spanish expulsion. Those who argue to erase Israel from the region today depend on the erasure of Jews from the region's history. It is a pristine example of why history matters. The suppression of this history is a necessary prerequisite for those who want to appropriate ideas like social justice and anti-colonialism to erase an entire country and an entire people today. So for those of us who are scholars who want to understand the country and the conflict, whether in an applied way or even just in the abstract, and also for those of us who just believe in the truth and in doing the right thing, we can't let this history be erased. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I invite everybody to take a breath because that was a lot of information and open your cameras. Like I said before, we love to see who we're talking to. We do have time for Q&A. That's why I asked Dr. Berman Gladstone to leave it a little short so that we have time to discuss. I know that this is a big topic. I have my talking points here, but if there are other people that want to put into the chat your question or even either raise your hand or open your camera, open your microphone, we're happy to have you actually speak your questions. Um, while you're thinking, I'm going to take a moment and ask, um, when you talk about Rav Alkalai, he comes at it very much from a religious heritage, but yet there is this interaction between, I mean, Herzl somehow got influenced by him too. So what was that take between, we know that the religious Zionism had issues with or religious non-Zionists had issues because the Zionists were so religious. So sorry, anti-religious because the Zionists were
Yeah.
so anti-religious. So how did Rav Alkalai have this interaction? Or if you know, I don't know if that's.
Yeah. So Simon Loeb Herzl, Theodor Herzl's grandfather, I think didn't have that same anti-religious bent, right? He was studying these topics in a religious frame, and context. Herzl's own vision, right? Theodor Herzl's vision is very secular. It's ardently so, and basically dismissive of the kind of religious framing that these ideas come from in the first place. And he also, in his initial writing, is not committed only to what he refers to as Palestine, as an option, right? In the Jewish state or the Jews state. He refers also to Argentina as a possibility. And ultimately he supports the Uganda plan. Um, the so there's certainly an important intellectual evolution here. What I see basically as the stripping of the religious and Sephardi elements of the idea and its sort of reinstallment, or its installment in the first place in a more bourgeois European frame of reference. But um, the idea remains fundamentally bound up with these longer histories and legacies. And ultimately, when Herzl brings the Uganda, when Herzl advocates for the Uganda plan to the Zionist Congress that he himself has put together, comprised of delegates that he, at least in its earliest iteration, selected and invited, he's unable to control the direction of the movement, and he meets with overwhelming backlash. A lot of that is from the Eastern European Zionist leadership, um, though there are also Sephardi delegates of various stripes at these congresses. And basically his attempt to take it in a different direction and make it something really embedded in the kind of European thought with which he was most familiar and most intimately acquainted. It didn't work because the fundamental it wasn't true to the idea or to its believers, and that's why he lost. And that's why actually the Zionism of today feels more in a lot of ways like Alkalai's Zionism than like Herzl's.
Thank you. Now, Lynn asked a question, and I don't know if you want to expand upon it, because with a democracy, I'm not sure who you can say who controls Israel today.
So, thank you, Benjamin. This is really illuminating and should be shared so people know more about the history. So, who is in control of the decisions today? The Orthodox right, but are Sephardim, and I've heard that they're second citizens and they're really not. Are they represented in the Knesset or not? Where's the power in Israel? And so that Sephardim are refugees, you know, so to speak. What's going on and how are they represented? I'd like to know.
Yeah, great. No, it's an important question. So there's been a long struggle for decades in Israel for equality of rights, not legal rights, but that was guaranteed from the start, right? But rights and representation for Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews in Israel, who are indeed underrepresented in many respects. Right? The major movement that everyone always thinks about and refers to is the Black Panthers in the early 1970s. But that drew on a longer protest tradition that began even before the State of Israel was founded, right? There was a Sephardi caucus at the Zionist congresses that even then protested underrepresentation in various ways, and a Yemeni union which is more closer to what I study sort of day to day in Mandate Palestine and then at the very beginning of Israeli statehood, that also protested and organized in various ways for rights within, especially the labor Zionist institutions. 1977 become the Mapach, the upheaval in Israeli politics, where labor is ousted by a right-wing government, by Likud, right, for the first time. Um, is a political watershed in a lot of ways. One of them is that it's a moment where Mizrahi and Sephardi voters and attempts by the Israeli right to appeal specifically to Mizrahi and Sephardi voters as a constituency bears real fruit and it goes from being a sort of specific issue to a fundamental kind of shaper of Israeli politics. So there still isn't a Mizrahi or Sephardi prime minister of Israel, but the political coalition on which the current Israeli government depends is substantial, not entirely, certainly, but substantially dependent on Mizrahi and Sephardi voters, and that has had very real, very concrete implications for economic progress, for investment in Mizrahi and Sephardi majority parts of the country, and also for political positions, for ministerial posts and other such things. So there's a long history of discrimination. That phrase, "the second Israel," it's a complicated one, but one that we should address and as seriously. And there have been meaningful transformations, and there's kind of a I would end this one with there's a bit of a sort of hope that there is a process because of the very high rates of marriage, but because there aren't really discrete Ashkenazi and Mizrahi or Sephardi families anymore because of so much. It's not even right to say intermarriage, right? Because of so much marriage of just all kinds of people in different parts of Israeli society, that the rising generation has and even the current ruling generation sort of right has substantial roots in different kinds of camps. Doesn't mean there's not racism, even for the same person can experience racism in one context and not another. But there's a path, hopefully, to the issue being more put to bed.
Thank you for the hope.
Noah, did you want to say your question, or do you want me to read it?
Sure. Sorry about my camera's off. My computer is not cooperating with me today.
No
Um,
worries.
yeah, so I was curious to know from your research, did Sephardim and Mizrahim understand Zionism to be a European ideology, or was it considered to be the modern manifestation of what was already an established idea or thought in Judaism?
It's a really good question. And it depended a lot on the context on where we're talking about. So in North Africa, where for example, where a lot of sort of engagement with modern ideas of various stripes, Zionism included, was, I'd say, played out in conjunction with the Alliance Israélite Universelle and with an understanding that that French culture is something discrete that has a meaningful presence in North Africa. I think you would see more thinking about Zionism as something European, along with many other sorts of ideas where that divide of European and indigenous is most stark. Um, for Zionist thinkers and leaders, especially in the land of Israel and what is now Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. Um, Especially there, they're really thinking about it as authentically part of a Sephardi intellectual and political tradition, and in fact, writing against the idea of Zionism as something European in a very explicit way. And the so Elia Sharho I put up on the screen earlier argues basically that all of these constructs, that the idea there's an old yishuv and a new yishuv, but also that Zionism is a discrete modern political ideology separate from all of these older precedents, these are all basically an imposition by Ashkenazi Jews in order to take credit for a tradition that has most authentically and seriously been represented and iterated upon and built by Sephardi Jews. So there's obviously a political flavor to that, but so to him, it's fundamentally Sephardi, fundamentally something that takes place in the land of Israel, and is kind of separated out only in a self-interested way by Jews coming from Europe. So there are these very and there are more subtle sort of gradations. A lot of Yemeni Jewish thinkers, for example, talk about Zionism as a European incarnation of cultural ideas that were at least equally prevalent in Yemen, speaking about like sort of constructing an idea of an authentic Hebrew culture and even of Jewish self-defense as something that was really authentic to Yemen. So basically, a lot of different communities would see Zionism as fundamentally their own or an evolution of something that's fundamentally their own. And depending on the context, it could also be sort of seen as European.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to note also you brought up Jacqueline Kanoff,
Mhm.
and I don't know if you've seen it. I don't know if other people have seen it. There's a book translated into English. David Ohana translated his book about her, or somebody translated it into English. So if you want to know more about her, a fascinating character, especially as a strong female character from Egypt. So I had to put that in there too.
Absolutely.
Um, I wanted to note also, we're talking about strong characters. It kind of struck me. We often think about, and since this is your field, the Yemenite Jews as a little more lambs, kind of, the soft, the sweet, the naive. And yet the two people you mentioned, Chezi Ovadia and Yisrael Yishayahu, were both Yemenites, and they're both the ones that came and powerfully. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but
No, yeah, maybe it's both. Yes, it's very important. This sort of there's a specific construct about that Yemeni Jews are often the really offensive word used as docile. And one of the ironies actually is that Yisrael Yishayahu Sharabi, and this is one of the reasons that I focus on him and am interested in him. He's also just a very interesting and important political and intellectual figure. But he in an earlier time was often held up as an example of that docility, because he was very close with David Ben-Gurion. He really advocated the Labor Party at a time of rampant discrimination in the Labor Party and Labor Party politics, against Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews. Um, and so he's sort of often the example of that. And yet, when you actually look at his written material, including his contemporary correspondence with other labor leaders, it's not just that it's a strong voice, it's a strong voice that is invested in specifically the fate of Yemeni Jews and will really protest these things. I mean, Yeshayahu was someone who he really deeply ideologically believed in the principles of labor Zionism and in these institutions. And he advocated for them because he believed in them. And that did not prevent him from advocating within them for justice for Yemeni Jews. Um, I mentioned earlier the Yemeni Union. If you really want to see real serious fire, right, you can look at the speeches which are available in the Knesset archive. You can access them easily. Figures like Zachariah Gluska, who are calling out racism, religious discrimination, of various kinds of discrimination against Yemeni religious practice, in really the most forceful of terms. And this is also part of the history of Zionism. This history of protest it's an important part of the history of Zionism. And one of these things that if we try to tell this unified story, that privileges the Ashkenazi, the European, the male, the bourgeois, we lose this actually really rich history, that is an important that really fundamentally shapes Israeli politics and society today in ways that we just often don't account for, in narrating Zionism. But so I'm glad that you brought that, because it's the Yemeni Jews are held up as the almost a model minority a lot of the time, in a way that now we might like cringe at, right? This sort of the docile image as against the equally racist, but in a very different way, image of Moroccan Jews as, and Yaron Swar really wrote about the evolution of these two ideas of the docile Yemeni Jew and the criminal Moroccan Jew as opposite ends of a spectrum, and as things as ideas that reinforce each other. And in fact, of course, none of it is true. Right? They're racist stereotypes, right? But it's really absurd, when you actually go into the text, and you can see that that's why it's also worth studying the evolution of ideas, because you can see that these ideas, you can see how they evolve and the role that they play, and have played it through history as an event that is meaningfully discrete from the actual histories of these communities and the real people who lived real lives in places like Yemen and Morocco.
Yeah, I have to say that it's just a funny anecdote here. I was in Casablanca a few years back hosted for a Shabbat lunch at a very nice young couple, who they had gone to college in America and came back to Casablanca to live. And we were talking, and there was a guest there also from Israel, who was a cousin. And she said, Moroccans are in Israel are seen as this violent type of community. And they look at her like, seriously, here we're the sweetest, nicest, most laid back. So it's kind of funny when you do that. And I do want to kind of close this off with, and I encourage you to keep writing. I'm sure that Benjamin, if I send you some questions or comments, that we can continue the conversation. But I want to give a pitch out there to continue this conversation even more, because like you said, the anti-Zionists often will use this as fodder for the anti-colonialism kind of thing. And if we don't help spread the Sephardi and Mizrahi part of this story, I think we're losing our own battle on our own end. I don't think it's them. I think it's within ourselves. I talk a lot about the fact that schools in Israel and in America are missing it, and we're working very hard me and my people to incorporate it into the schools. And I know you're working hard to incorporate it into colleges and into across the board. So I encourage us all to continue to promote it, and to make sure that everybody knows that this is part of our narrative. It's not separate narratives. It is narratives within this tapestry. So we're each giving our own. So thank you very much for helping to round that out. Like I said, I encourage you to continue the conversation. All of you who are here, thank you for joining. And be in touch, because we can't help spread our story unless we talk to each other. So let's continue the conversation, listen to Ayuni talk, and thank you again. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you very
rest of
much.
your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.